All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're here to welcome Jon Thaxton to speak with us. Jon is a leading advocate for protecting the natural environment, a fifth-generation Sarasotan. He was raised on a family farm near Osprey, Florida, and began working at his family's real estate company at the age of 14. Can't hear me there? Louder? Okay. Jon began his environmental advocacy at Venice High School in 1974 as a founding member of the Ecology Club. And in 1996, he was featured in National Geographic for his efforts to protect endangered species. He also served for 12 years on the Sarasota County Board of Commissioners. We welcome Jon Thaxton.
Wow, that is for sure the kind of introduction I like. I hate these prolonged things, or this third child is crazy. I'm just gonna make sure this works.
Yes.
All right. So let me thank you all for coming. My name is Jon Thaxton. I'm a little bit nervous tonight because I typically speak to strangers and I have a lot of friends in the room. and it's easier. Those of you that talk in public, it's a lot easier to do it with strangers than it is with people you know. So here's what I'm going to do. For those of you that don't know me, I have spent my entire adult life, 45 years now, as an active participant in environmental conservation and land use planning in Sarasota County. And I was asked to put this presentation together because I am truly unique in that respect. I remember who was doing this in 1975, 76, and they've been gone for 20, 30 years. So there is no cohort for me to actually point to that says, well, this person has done it also. There have been some land use attorneys. Actually, I'm in the second generation of land use attorneys that were doing land use back in the mid-70s, but even most of the land use attorneys that got paid for doing this work back then have long since retired. So I felt that it was important to speak with as many that would listen about what has happened over the last 45 years in Sarasota County about land use planning and conservation efforts. I believe sincerely that a better informed population, knowing what happened in the past, will better prepare us for future decisions and making better decisions in the future. There is a little bit of a warning here. There are times, actually a lot of times, where this presentation is going to sound pessimistic. It's not my goal for it to sound pessimistic. I wish it didn't, but I want it to be real. I want it to be truthful, and I'm just warning you right now that that's likely going to happen. You're going to be thinking to yourself, my God, this is terrible, blah, blah, blah. And I also want to make another preface to this, in that this is not a condemnation, it's not an indictment of people that are in power now. I'm going to be going back in time, way back in time, and I'm going to be talking about many generations of county commissioners, many generations of land planners, many generations of folks like that. And so don't think that when I say commissioners, elected officials, or decision makers, I'm not talking about the people that are here today. I'm talking about the people that have been a part of this decision over the last 45 years. So with that, let's get started. This is my family. This is the Knight family. This photograph was taken just north of 5 Points in downtown Sarasota. And I like to point that out because if you notice behind some of my great uncles there's barbed wire. So if you can imagine barbed wire. That little girl to the lower right of the screen, that's my grandma. That is Margaret. And she doesn't look really happy in that photograph. But anyways, that's the Knight family. So if you go back into the Sarasota history, look for Knight and Knight's Emporium and things, and that's my maternal side of the family from which I came. Sarasota looked a lot different when that photograph was taken in 1912, 1915. This is 5 Points.
Wow.
And a lot of stories I can tell about 5 Points. I had some great uncles that caught young alligators in the Mayaca, and they brought them to the 5 Point trough. And they just loved to watch the people try to fish out these young alligators so that they didn't bite the cattle and stuff. But not only did 5 Points in downtown look a lot different in Sarasota, so too did the rest of the county. 2/3 of Sarasota County was covered in 2 habitats, one of them called pine flatwoods and the other one known as grassy dry prairie. 2/3 of the county. And these are habitats that are essential to wildlife, but they're also essential to our water quality because rainfall would come. We get about 60 inches a year, and it would fall on these beautiful flatwoods, and it would fall on these gorgeous pine prairie, these grassy dry prairies, and it would just stay there forever, and it would slowly creep up. But in that time, that water is becoming purified. But not only was it important for water quality and water purification, but it was also very important for a lot of wildlife and game. I chose this bobwhite because as a child growing up in Palmer Ranch, this was my favorite game to hunt, but it was also really important for numerous other threatened and endangered species. Much more rare in Sarasota County were these scrub habitats. They were home to the most endangered of the wildlife found in Sarasota County, including the globally imperiled Paramiscus scrub mouse, found only in these scrubs, found only in Peninsula Florida, and relatives of this are only found in the Isthmus of Panama and in the continent of Australia. So it's a really cool little creature that is here. This animal, as well as numerous others, including the eastern indigo snake and the gopher tortoise, came here during the Pleistocene Ice Age when the Gulf of Mexico had its entire shelf exposed. And so all of these western affinity animals used that shelf to move from the western states into the state of Florida. And then, as we all know, the glaciers receded, the water returned into the Gulf of Mexico. So all of these animals were trapped here in Sarasota, and they became their own separate and endangered species. So there are these amazing artifacts of this geological phenomenon that is not going to ever be repeated, but they are so precious and they're so rare and they're so endangered and it's so important on many levels, but for me, that geological phenomenon is one of the most important. Sarasota County at the time, in particular, eastern Sarasota County, was dotted with these ephemeral, isolated wetlands, they call them. It kind of made the county look a little bit like Swiss cheese. But what's really important about these wetlands is that they all had different hydroperiods, meaning that some of the wetlands were wet all the time. They never dried up. And some of the wetlands would go dry like every year or every other year. And this differentiation between the hydroperiods is exactly what the natural environment needed in order to support all of the wildlife that depended upon the wetlands. The one that I like to bring out as an example is the gopher frog, Gopherus polyphemus. This particular frog is also on the species special concern list, meaning that it's almost endangered but not quite there. Just give it time. But it will only be able to reproduce itself where it can lay its eggs and subsequent hatching tadpoles in wetlands that go dry virtually every year. Why is that? Well, because if a wetland goes dry every year, it cannot support finfish. And the finfish are what eat the tadpoles and the eggs. So in order for the narrowmouth frog and the gopher frog and other amphibians, in order to survive, they need these wetlands of various hydroperiods. They need these wetlands situated in that Swiss cheese configuration, and they need these wetlands with the intervening scrubs and the grassy dry prairies and the pine flatwoods. After that comes the herbaceous grassy sloughs. These are basically like if you can imagine a very shallow pan river with only the center of it being open water and all of the edges being covered by this herbaceous growth. Again, another remarkable feature in water quality maintenance, because this was not a rushing channel. I mean, even during the rainy season, you could barely see the water moving over these grassy sloughs, these herbaceous sloughs. All of the habitats that I just talked about, the grassy dry prairie, the pine flatwoods, the herbaceous sloughs, and the isolated wetlands, they're all maintained by fire. And they've been maintained by fire ever since Florida came out of the Gulf of Mexico some 15, 20 million years ago. In fact, the fires in Sarasota County have been happening so often that the plant and the animals are now not necessarily just adapted to the fire, they're dependent upon the fire. You remove the fire from any of these habitats that I just described, and the flora and the fauna dies. The ecological value dies. Fire is absolutely essential for these systems. Historically, though, the fires would occur every 2 to 3 years in the flatwoods, every 5 to 10 years in the scrubs. And an interesting note about the fires. Here's a fire running through a Sarasota County flatwoods in eastern Sarasota County. But look at the flame height of that fire. It's very low, right? A person could take a running start and actually jump over this fire very safely. But look at the back side of this fire. What do you see? You see black. It's charcoal. Charcoal is the quintessential natural filter for water that we know of. So think of this, 2/3 of Sarasota County, 2/3 of it before Europeans got here, burned black to the ground every 3 to 5 to 6 years. So we had hundreds of thousands of charred acres that were not only having their water filtered by all the systems and things that I described, but also through these amazing, this fire regime. So after the flatwoods, we move into the hammocks. The hammocks are a little bit different. They have a great deal of shade. Historically, there's no shade in Sarasota County, as the fires killed all of the shade trees. And that's what the wildlife liked. But in these hammocks, you had this rich organic soil that did not burn, but about every couple hundred years. The hammocks provided shade, they provided refugia for wildlife, they provided for wildlife quarters, both nocturnal and diurnal quarters, for animals such as the Florida panther and the black bear. So while they may have spent their nighttime hours in the flatwoods, they may spend their daylight hours in the hammocks seeking some refuge. And then after we leave the upland portions of the Sarasota habitats, we move into the rivers and streams. This was the source of, if you read the old historic books about Sarasota County, this is the habitat that everybody talked about. And as a child growing up, it was the lakes, rivers, streams that my uncles and my great uncles had all of their stories about. If you lived in Sarasota at the turn of the century before, everybody in Sarasota knew these lakes, rivers, and streams by name. They knew what game was there. They knew what habitat was there. For me, it's pretty much amazing how we have become disconnected to these once storied landscapes. And as we move on downstream, we run into the mangrove forests, the estuaries, if you would. These are considered to be the most productive of biomes to be found anywhere on the planet Earth. This is where the saltwater meets the freshwater. And not only are these also responsible for the uptake of nutrients and the balancing of water quality, this is where a great deal, the hammocks and the estuary is where a great deal of carbon sequestration naturally happens. And it's also a great place for fisheries. And in early Sarasota County, today we kind of think of fisheries and think of catching redfish, snook, and trout from a boat. But in early Sarasota County, these fisheries were a major source of economic development. This particular photograph is of Casey Key. The bridge you see there is the very first Blackburn Point Bridge. The little structure off to the lower right is the Taylor Fish Camp, a camp that I grew up in and spent a great deal of time in as a young boy. The barrier islands back in that time were completely different than they were today. This is Point of Rocks, and if you look behind Point of Rocks and the landscape of Siesta Key, there's virtually nothing there. This is a time where the Gulf beaches could accrete, they could erode, the passes could open and they could close, and they would do so at the whim of nature, but obviously things are quite different today. So I want to shift now using these historic views of Sarasota County's environmental systems into the population growth of Sarasota County over the last few years. So as I told you, my family arrived, well, I didn't give you the exact year, somewhere between 1887 and 1889. They're not sure. The first population really that I could find was in 1921. And soon after my family, the Knight family, arrived, by 1921, the population had skyrocketed to 5,000 people. By 1950, there were 28,000 people in Sarasota County. I want you to mostly pay attention to where these blue dots are at. New growth in the next slides, will be represented by green dots. But if you notice, there is a concentration around the city of Sarasota, the city of Venice, and a little bit in Inglewood, but not a heck of a lot more than that. So I'm going to move up in 20-year intervals. This is 1970. Of interesting note, in 1970, you can see the Mackle brothers, what was then considered to be one of the biggest real estate boondoggles in Florida history, had started in Northport, so you can see Northport, but you can also see the Venice Nokomis areas and Inglewood starting to spread out, and Sarasota is doing a very good job. But you can clearly see a distinction between these, if you would, these towns or these metro areas, even along the coast. By 1990, you are starting to see the coastline begin to fill in, and you're starting to see this assault, if you would, on the eastern lands in Sarasota, in Sarasota County. By the year 2020, this process of uninterrupted urban sprawl has consumed the entire coast of Sarasota. You can no longer distinguish where Osprey, Laurel, Nokomis, Sarasota, Inglewood, Venice, where one begins and the other one ends, as they are all interconnected. And you can also see in this 2020 population photograph, you can see the incredible expansion of growth in eastern Sarasota County, and also you can see Venice also not only expanding to the east, but also to the north. And it was during this time that the city of Northport annexed tens of thousands of acres from Sarasota County, so that development of Northport could then spread to the west, connecting Northport to the center, to the municipality of Venice. And all of these trends, I would add, as I was there and I watched it, are developer driven. Now, a person might think that this sort of a growth pattern has to be unregulated and unplanned, right? If you were to think that, you would be wrong. Because in 1975, beginning in 72 and then in 75, recognizing the serious threat to Florida's quality of life, natural environment, and its economy, the state legislators approved Saving Paradise, the Florida Environmental Land and Management Act. And in 1975, it was followed by what we know now as the Growth Management Act. And what these two acts did in concert with one another was they said, look, every county and every municipality in the city, in the state of Sarasota, is going to be required to have a adopted comprehensive plan that actually managed growth, to make sure that things such as infrastructure, such as traffic and utilities and the natural environment, were not threatened by the future growth. State mandate. So here's Sarasota County's first attempt at a comprehensive plan. This year is 1975. A couple things to point out here. The tan area, the lighter tan area, and even those darker squiggly tan areas are natural areas. Those are areas that are set aside where development cannot occur. And you can even see here a clear separation between Venice and Northport. You can see many instances where these rural lands actually were way far west of I-75. In 1981, the county adopted its award-winning concentric circle plan. Again, it institutionalized this concept that we were going to contain growth in the urban cores of Northport, Inglewood, Venice and Nokomis, and in Sarasota. You can still see west of I-75 no build zones where rural lands were supposed to be preserved. 1981. In 1989, the plan changed considerably. You can now see the entire suburbanization west of I-75 from Manatee County line all the way to the Charlotte County line. But an interesting note, because the county commission at that time said, well, we're going to urbanize all of the coastal county, we are going to put a policy in the comprehensive plan that says under no conditions whatsoever, ever, will urban growth be allowed east of I-75. You laugh, but this was serious. And it's written in the plan as law. And the community said, okay, that sounds good. We're going to preserve the agriculture and the open space and the watersheds and all this east of I-75. And in exchange for that, we're going to urbanize our entire coast. So here we are in 1999. It looks somewhat similar, if you think about it, to the 89 plan, which preceded it 10 years earlier. But here, the urban containment boundary policy has miraculously disappeared. The county commission voted to do away with it. So if you look up in in Sarasota County around Richardson Road and Fruitville Road, you can actually see this yellow urban designation codified, incorporated in the 1991 plan. And as far as I was concerned, this was the plan that made the urbanization of virtually all, especially northern Sarasota County, imminent. I want to move finally to the 2023 plan. This plan on the surface looks pretty good. You can see in the lime green there, you can see the efforts of many of us in the conservation of the Mayaca Island. But I want to call your attention to that kind of funky military green looking area there. Again, this is where we said in our comprehensive plan, these are the areas of agriculture and things, and these are the areas that we're not going to allow suburbanization in. But there's something underlying this plan, which I think is kind of ironic because it's called an overlay district, but it's really kind of subversive and underlying. And that would be something called Sarasota 2050. And Sarasota 2050, let me read you an exact quote here because I love this. I love this quote. Sarasota 2050 was the grand bargain among rural preservationists, environmentalists, developers, and landowners. 2050 was to be a master plan that would accommodate population growth while breaking with Florida's history of indiscriminately carving up the countryside. So what 2050 did in this grand bargain was it allowed this urban form of development in eastern Sarasota County that would otherwise be preserved, provided that it met numerous conditions. The communities had to be walkable. They had to be self-sufficient with their own internal commercial. And they did this by planting these villages and hamlets. And in exchange for that, everything else was going to be permanently protected. And you should start to hear a trend here now. This, from now on, everything is going to be protected kind of thing, because you've been hearing it since 1980, and here we are in 2023. So this is several decades of these promises. In fact, this 2050 won the new Congress Urbanism Award. But to further make sure that eastern Sarasota County was protected, not only by the covenants that were in 2050 for all this fiscal neutrality, walkable communities, enhanced wildlife corridors, enhanced preservation of open space, and all these other things. A group of citizens got together and amended Sarasota County's charter. And what the county, you don't have to read all of this, I'm just going to highlight the important part. And by the way, those of you that don't know what a county charter is, Sarasota County is one of the few counties in the state of Florida that's a charter county, which means we are an extension of the state of Florida. The charter for us is like the Constitution for the United States. So what these citizens did is they put into our Constitution, into our charter, that any density increases outside of that urban area, which I showed you on the other map, would be required to be fiscally neutral. And what fiscally neutral means is that the new development is going to pay its own way, right? The existing people are not going to have to increase their taxes in order for the new people to come in here and enjoy the infrastructure that they need, such as roads, parks, libraries, schools, roads, fire stations, and things like that. And they also says in this that in order for that to happen, it's going to require a unanimous vote of the county commission. And those of you that follow politics, unanimous votes are very difficult because they give every member of the commission veto power. So we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. And we were so confident in this promise that the county made that they were going to preserve the eastern area with 2050, that we said, and look at the bottom line there, is that the goals, amendments, and policies of the 2050 plan will not be subject to these charter amendments. Not be. So any other place you can do it, but in 2050, since you can't. Since its adoption of 2050, in the year 2002, I was there. I brought a bottle of champagne into the county commission chambers that we drank after we adopted this plan. All of these promises have been compromised or broken entirely. This promise of compact, walkable, non-gated new urbanist communities with multiple forms of integrated housing types, including affordable housing, are now gone. And they have been replaced with much of the same old suburban type sprawl that we've seen elsewhere in the county. These required internal commercial spaces have largely been replaced with centers at the intersection, just like we've seen everywhere else. The enhanced environmental protection standards, including the greenways, the corridors, and the setbacks, have all been compromised or functionally eliminated. Mm-hmm. And the intensity transects that were required in the village, in the hamlets, have been reduced also or eliminated to the point of now being non-existent. And probably the one that irks me the most is the fiscal neutrality. But I put this slide in here. I found this book. Today, I would best describe Sarasota County's comprehensive planning process from the perspective of the citizen as broken promises. Because indeed, all of these things, this is a slide from the county when we adopted 2050, all of these promises have been compromised. But again, the one that irks me the most is fiscal neutrality. We had a commitment in the 2050 plan, we had a commitment in the charter that these communities were going to pay for themselves. And I put this is an actual slide, I put in the yellow lines there. And the facilities that 2050 new urbanism were going to be bound to, promise that they have to do, are transportation and fire. The Board of County Commissioners just adopted allocations for the $1 billion infrastructure surtax that many of you voted on in this room. Probably none of you knew that embedded in those allocations was almost $100 million, more than any other departmental allocation, more than parks, more than libraries, more than public safety, more than anything, was an allocation to build transportation infrastructure and fire stations to support the 2050 villages. Mm-hmm. So clearly, this commitment for fiscal neutrality has been violated in a most severe way. In fact, the only commitment in 2050 that has been maintained is the promise of additional densities. Those have been kept, if not enhanced. For me, 2050 is nothing more than a Trojan horse. It was a mistake. It was a vehicle to get those densities on the books. All of the other commitments have been compromised. I would suggest, others have suggested that things have changed, and they have, right? It's a little bit different socially, a little bit different economically, a little bit different real estate. But remind you, this was an overlay district. If things have changed, the right thing to do for the public would have been to remove 2050 and go back to where we started, where everything was zoned for rural agriculture and 5-acre ranchettes. That would have been the fair thing to do, but that is clearly not what has happened. 2050, in my 16 years of adjudicator for land planning in Sarasota County, was by far the worst decision I'd ever made. So let's look now at the outcomes of this population and these planning decision process that we have. Just for kicks, I had to throw in another picture of 5 Points. So this is 5 Points today. It looks much different, but then again, so does the rest of the county. Most of the pine flatwoods and the grassy dry prairies have been replaced by subdivisions that are incapable of providing the water quality and the habitat function that these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of flatwoods once did. Our wetlands have been used as depressions to be further dug out for these failing stormwater ponds that have very minimal, if no, water quality improvements. In fact, some of them are so dysfunctional they contribute to water quality degradation. Clearly, the habitat value and function of these ponds can in no way compare to the herbaceous wetlands, those beautiful isolated wetlands that I showed earlier. Our lakes, our rivers and streams and grassy sloughs have been replaced by canals. So instead of having this gradual seeping of the water into the estuaries, we now flush it like pulling the handle on a toilet. It's full of nutrients, it's full of pollutants, it's full of sediment, and it is not the same ecological system. I'm going to go through a couple slides here of actual situations. I'm moving now into the hammocks. This is a hardwood bayhead. It's another form of hammock. I took this photograph, and then 2 weeks later, if you look right at the bottom there, you see a little stream, and you see just a little sliver of that black soil that I was describing before. That's so responsible. Mind you, it takes hundreds of years for this soil to be created, but yet it's so important for water quality and for carbon sequestration. This is 2 weeks later. You can see all of the vegetation has been obliterated. The soils are now being excavated. They're going to be moved off to the side, and these soils are going to be replaced with compacted, nutrient-poor soils that can actually support buildings, parking lots, and roads. So all of the carbon sequestration value of this wetland is gone. By the way, the comprehensive plan says that these hardwood hammocks shall be preserved. And this is what it looks like today. Unfortunately, our mangrove fringe, our mangrove forests, are now legally trimmed to the point where the value and the function that they once provided to water quality, carbon sequestration, and habitat for fisheries is now severely degraded. Sarasota County has now the dubious distinction of having the highest percentage of its estuarine coastline hardened. So instead of having these wonderful mangrove forests and these spartina marshes, you have seawalls. These seawalls have forever locked in the ability for our intertidal habitats to migrate up and down with sea level. They're gone, and they're functionally gone forever. The result of all of this is that we're now dumping these nutrients into the bay to the point where we're killing seagrasses. The street gas die-off is killing our East Indian manatee to the point where 2 years ago, extinction was a very real possibility. There was a little bit of resurgence since then, but something bad is going to happen again, and we're going to be right back to where we're talking about. These nutrients are now flushed in the Sarasota Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. These anthropogenic nutrients that are created from converting these grassy dry prairies and these flatwoods and these sloughs and these wetlands into subdivisions and shopping malls, that we are fueling red tides to the extent that they're now multi-year, they're lasting longer, they are more intense, and they're covering a greater extent of our coastline, causing both economic and health concerns, not only for wildlife, but for humans. I want to talk really quickly about the scrub habitats. This is a photograph, obviously it'd be a long time ago, before the county commission graded me out severely. This is the Joel Sartori photograph featured in National Geographic. But again, in the comprehensive plan, the scrub habitats occupied by threatened and endangered species such as the Florida scrub jay shall be preserved. Shall is described in the comprehensive plan as mandatory, no questions asked. This is the site that I photographed several years ago. This is at the corner of Laurel and US 41. Clearly, it's scrub habitat. You can see to the right, and clearly it's occupied by threatened and endangered species, but they were able to find an environmental consultant, much like they did on the hammock that I showed you before, that said that these habitats are compromised and they're not worthy of preserving, and so they allowed them to be destroyed. All of the scrub are extinct. They have been there for 5,000 years, and they will never ever be there again. This is what focused mostly on the natural systems and the impacts of this terrible comprehensive planning that we've done in our community and many communities in the state of Florida. But that's not where the story stops. The traffic that you're experiencing today is also a manifestation of this very poor land use planning. And let me warn you, right now, you ain't seen nothing yet. The last 250,000 people that came into this area, we accommodated the additional transportation needs of that population influx by widening existing roads. Fruitville Road, Bee Ridge Road, Bay Vista Road, Jacaranda Road, on and on and on and on. All of these major arterial collectors and connectors in Sarasota County are now built to their ultimate capacity. We can't widen them anymore. But as I want to show you in a minute, there's another 200,000 to 400,000 people that are already approved to move to Sarasota. We will not be able to accommodate that additional traffic the way that we had them before by widening roads because we can't widen them anymore. They're done. Curing traffic congestion by widening roads is about as stupid as curing obesity by loosening your belt buckle. It just doesn't work. Sooner or later, you run out of loose, and now you have a problem that's very difficult to solve. Another problem, Sarasota County's affordable housing. The crisis that we're seeing today is, again, another manifestation of the goals, objectives, and policies in these comprehensive plans. I did a review about 4 or 5 years ago, of the policies addressing affordable housing in Sarasota County. There were about 27, 28 of them. I got county staff with permission of the Board of County Commissioners to determine the efficacy of these policies. Of the 27 policies in the comprehensive plan, they have not produced a single affordable housing unit outside those policies, outside those units that were created through either the private sector donation or the federal government. But yet, we continue to approve more land use every day, every hour in Sarasota County that creates more market rate housing, that is increasing the demand for the service workforce of which we are providing zero housing for. So we wonder why we have an affordable housing problem. Just look to these comprehensive plans where we have no policies that require anybody, the developers or government or anyone, to accommodate these increased affordable housing demands. This is my good friend Buster Longino. Buster Longino would be turning over in his grave right now if he saw what was happening to the amazing ranch lands in Sarasota County that defined this community for generations and generations and generations that are now being lost. Water shortages. One likes to think that these water shortages are over, that we're set. I would call your attention to the recent presentation of the utility staff to the Board of County Commissioners, there's many pinch points where water supply is so close to water demand that running out of water is a possibility, unless, of course, we compromise the environment, which is what we tend to do in this country. You can look at the date on this. This is November 2023. This is just a couple months ago, where the Water Management District decried a water shortage. But unfortunately, the state of Florida has prevented local governments from regulating growth based upon concurrency measures, such as the availability of water supply. So a little bit of good news. I told you this was going to be a little bit on the pessimistic side. A little bit of good news. So for the past 30 plus years, 40 years, a group of us have been building on the amazing work of two generations before us to preserve environmental lands, natural lands in Sarasota County. This just shows you a rundown of the referendum and the activity that we had. The only one that I did not work on was in 1973. I started in the 77, and from then on in, I have been one of the major orchestrators of these environmental lands campaigns. And I bring that up only because that's what I'm going to close with here in just a minute. But the result of these plans is this. If you were fortunate enough to be traveling in the International Space Station during daylight hours as you were passing over Southwest Florida, and you leaned out the port side window, and you took a photograph, this is the photograph you would get. And you see the results here of this 3-generation work in preserving the lands in eastern Sarasota County. It represents 135,000 acres. 135,000 acres. And unless something unbelievable or inconceivable happens, the county will not be able to reverse, and developers will not be able to get their hands on and convert it from something that looks like this to something that looks like that white stuff you see there along the coast. I'm often asked, this represents, by the way, about a third of the county. I'm often asked, when is enough enough? We have a third of the county presently in public ownership in conservation status through fee simple acquisitions or conservation easements. But 2/3 of the county is still available for development. And I'd say to developers and others when they ask me, when is enough enough? I would say, when is enough for your side? Because if I go to the voters, if I go to virtually any person in my Publix checkout line and ask them, do you want more open space? Do you want more parks? Do you want more green space? Do you want more development? You know, I think you're going to have a hard time finding an ally for your position rather than mine that advocates for more green space. So, in closing, a few months ago, I did a talk, and it occurred to me that we need to know what in Sarasota County have we developed, what in Sarasota County is unavoidably to be developed, what in Sarasota County is kind of in the midway, and what in Sarasota County have we preserved. So I went to Sarasota County Planning Department, and they could not answer that question. So I said, isn't that kind of important? You know, if you're a long-range planning department, don't you want to know where you've been, where you're at, where you're going? And so anyways, I got cut off. I was not allowed to use planning resources to prepare the maps that you're about ready to see. And this is the first time they've been seen in the public, is during this presentation that I've made now for several times. So I got my good friend Kevin Cooper. He works at Marine. He's like so wicked smart. Makes me jealous. And he and I and others put together this map. And what you're looking at here is the brown or the tan areas. Those are the areas, the municipalities, and the areas that are already approved for growth in Sarasota County. So what they represent in that tan area is about 435,000 residential units. Mind you, there's about 2.3 people, 2.1, 2.2 people per residential unit in Sarasota County's demography. And I did this, I forgot to mention, the reason I did this is because if I were to go back, and I'm not going to do it, if I were to go back to that 2023 comp plan, you remember how confusing it looked? Remember how many colors were in there? Well, I did this to kind of simplify it so that we could see at a glance where we're at. So the tan areas are those areas where really it's done, guys. The planning has been done. You're not going to reverse it. It's either built or it's going to be built within the next couple years. The magenta area, the purple area, are the areas mostly 2050 where there might be some hope. You know, I've almost given up hope on the 2050 lands, but I put them there just for the sake of argument. And then the green areas are those that are in public ownership. So the approved area is about 435 development units. That purple area represents another 40,000 development units. And of course, the green area represents public lands where there are basically no development. So what this kind of portrays is this race, this rivalry between protection and development in our thing. So then I thought, let me take this one more step and simplify it further. If we were to think of ourselves, what's left? What is left to make decisions about, land use decisions about in Sarasota County? And again, the county cannot answer this question, which is the reason that motivated me to put these two slides together. That's it. That's it. Everything in black is the magenta, the tan, and the green. And I would offer to you, those are the areas where the decisions have already been made. But nobody is thinking along these lines. And the white areas are the areas where the decisions have yet to be made. So we have 321,000 acres in Sarasota County that have already been planned for. And we have 34,000 acres left, basically 10%. We planned functionally for 90% of Sarasota County, and there's only 10% left that has a decision point left to do. So I love extremes because I think extremes make a point, and I'm going to close with this point. We know because of evidence in War Mineral Springs and other places in Sarasota County that we've had humans occupying Sarasota County for 12,000 years. And for 12,000 years, humans have had this opportunity to make this choice, whether or not we're going to preserve it or not. The people sitting in this room truly represent the last population, the last generation of Sarasota County that are going to have that choice. We will have made functionally every planning decision in the entirety of Sarasota County, from DeSoto County to the Gulf of Mexico, from Manatee County to Charlotte County, in the next 5 to 10 years. It'll all be done. And I say this because in 2026, we're going to have our final referendum to ask the citizens of Sarasota County, what do you want to do with this last 10%? We can either preserve it for watershed protection, threatened and endangered species, open space, and agriculture, or we can let it also go towards development. If we were to preserve it, we would end up with a county of 60% developed lands or 40% preserved. And I would suggest that is the option that the vast majority of the citizens in this county would prefer to have. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have.
So for the folks in the room, what is the most important thing they can do to help preserve that 10%?
So the referendum will not be coming around for a couple more years, which is when the existing referendum volunteer to help with that referendum. We have had great success in the last, as you saw, in the last 5 or 6. The last referendum for preservation of open spaces in Sarasota County passed by 77%. We hope to enjoy that type of a margin again because, like I said, it's going to be the last time. But more importantly, this is kind of preaching to the choir with the League of Women Voters, but I like to joke, and I joke with a great deal of sincerity. There seems to be one day every 2 years where we forget all this. That's election day. We're not paying attention. We're not. I I have people come to me all the time, almost daily, and complain about the traffic, complain about the area where the wildlife was playing in their field or their forest next to them, and it's destroyed and they're gone. What can we do? And I say, well, I don't want to get personal, but who'd you vote for? And then when I find out, I said, well, why don't you go back and look at that person's voting record and see how they voted on these very important decisions for protecting human life through health and human services and protecting the natural environment through strong development codes that actually tell developers no. And this always confounded me. Why do we call it a permit process when we always say yeah, right? I mean, if you're asking for permit or permission to do something, no should be a viable answer, right? But we're not very keen on doing that in this community. The answer is all too often yes. And the issues that I've described here, dealing with affordable housing and environmental protection, they're rarely discussed at these land use hearings. So what you can do is voting counts, voting matters. And I don't think we're electing necessarily the people that reflect our values, both locally and non-locally. But I say that obviously with a great deal of vulnerability in saying it, because there are those elected officials that do. And don't ask me to tell you which ones do and which ones don't. That's your job to figure that out. So become educated, become engaged, and vote accordingly.